Unless you've been living under a rock recently, or more likely just have a life outside of arguing about 40k, you probably heard the news. We've got a new retcon alert, and this one's concerning the Eldar. And how do you think the Warhammer community reacted to these changes? Did they spark a lot of insightful civil discussions? Were people engaged in tasteful discourse about how the old could work with the new? Absolutely not. This is the internet, my friend, where everybody hates everything all of the time. And 40k fans hate two things more than anything else: when things stay the same for too long and change. And boy, let me tell you, Eldar fans were pissed. People were saying that the change to Wraithbone spit on 30 years worth of established canon, that the Eldar had been gutted as a faction, and it was clear that Gamesworkshop just didn't care about space elves anymore. Which, in fairness, that last one might have a little bit of truth to it. But why would a change to Wraithbone, the stuff that the Eldar tanks and guns are made out of, be met with such negative backlash? How could a single change like this possibly have such widespread catastrophic effects on the entire faction? Is Wraithbone really that important? What even is it, and what actually changed? Were people's reactions justified, or was this a retcon that wasn't really a retcon at all and people are losing their minds over nothing? Well, in this video, we're gonna dive into all that and a whole lot more. And I'm not gonna lie, I thought this would be a quick little video that I could summarize the changes and then flip back through some old codexes to find some evidence to prove that it's not really that big of a deal, but I kinda ended up getting sucked down a research rabbit hole that made me feel like I was losing my mind and living in some type of alternate dimension. But don't worry, we're gonna get into it. But before we dive headfirst into the Grimdark, I've got a huge announcement to make. Behind the scenes, me and Into the AM, the sponsor of this video, have been working on a brand new collab t-shirt, inspired by this channel, everything that we talk about, and this little community that we've all built. Introducing the brand new Galactic Siege graphic tee, designed to capture what the essence of the Grimdark is all about. It features a lone cosmic explorer, encountering galactic horrors beyond human comprehension. I'm gonna be honest, I think this is our best collab yet, and I'm super happy with how it came out. Not only is it the best type of distinct, legally distinct, but it's also my favorite color, glow in the dark. If you want to help support me, this channel, and everything that we do here, then click on the link in the description of this video and pick one up for yourself today. Into the AM is giving me a small commission for each and every one of them sold. Honestly, if you couldn't tell, I'm a massive fan of Into the AM's clothing lines, and at this point, they're pretty much exclusively what I wear on the day-to-day. Their designs run the gambit between being loud, bombastic, and super colorful, to kinda subdued and artistically beautiful. And if you've never checked out Into the AM before, they have an absolutely massive catalog. So no matter what your specific tastes, they definitely have something just for you. So what are you waiting for? Elevate your style today by going to intotheam.com by clicking on my link in the description to save 10% off your entire order. And when you do, make sure to pick up one of these amazing Galactic Siege t-shirts for yourself in order to support me, the channel, and all of the future videos we're gonna make. Big thanks to Into the AM for sponsoring this video and for being such a long-time supporter of this channel. Now, back to the Grimdark. If you're not a big aficionado of Eldar lore, you might be a little lost on why so many people were freaking out about the recent changes to Wraithbone. You might not even really know what Wraithbone is and why it's so important. So in order to understand what's changed, we need to know what the lore of Wraithbone was up until the release of the 10th edition Eldar Codex back in February. Now, at the risk of sounding a little bit hyperbolic, Wraithbone is quite literally the most versatile construction material ever created, and it can be used to produce anything its wielder can imagine, both figuratively and literally. It is what pretty much everything the Craftworld Eldar have ever produced is made from their weapons and armor, their planes and tanks, even the continent-sized Craftworld ships they live on. It isn't like any other construction material that you'll find in the physical universe, and that's because it's not from our universe at all. Wraithbone is quite literally the raw essence of the Immaterium channeled into reality, given structure, and formed into tangible objects via psychically charged harmonic frequencies. Wraithbone can come in infinite different forms. It can be thin and pliable, or upwards of 1,000 times harder than steel. It is highly resilient to damage, able to naturally generate a psychic force field, and can even self-repair. Aside from its seemingly limitless potential, the thing that makes Wraithbone so valuable to a full psyker species like the Eldari is the fact that Wraithbone itself is psychically resonant. Objects produced from it act like a psychic conductor that is able to carry psychic energy in a similar manner to how wires or cables carry electricity. This means that every single Eldar can channel a portion of their own psychic energy through it in order to control whatever device the Wraithbone takes the form of. Whether that be something as simple as an interface that allows them to pilot a plane or a tank, or a weapon that amplifies and focuses their psychic power. When it comes to actually making stuff out of Wraithbone, this is something that is mostly exclusive to any Eldar that walks the path of the artisan. All of them are trained in conjuring simple Wraithbone structures, normally in the form of works of art. But I should mention that in the Fabius Bile trilogy, we did see Fabius himself experimenting with and making some pretty crazy things out of Wraithbone, such as a chip he implants in his brain that allows him to transfer his consciousness to a new clone whenever he dies. We also saw that he taught a bunch of Noise Marines how to cultivate and grow Wraithbone by using their song. However, these examples aside, for the most part, Wraithbone is normally exclusively an Eldar thing. And when it comes to the really valuable and complex Wraithbone constructs, this is carried out by specialist individuals known as Bone Singers. If you're not familiar with them, their name is kinda on the nose. You can think of them as psychic construction workers, architects, and engineers that conjure and mold Wraithbone by singing it into existence. The more skilled a Bone Singer is, the less time it will take to produce something of value. And oftentimes, when working on a particularly large Wraithbone project, they'll work together in choirs to speed up the process. Although Wraithbone may look like bone, crystal, or stone, it's traditionally described as being more akin to a plant or living tissue. And although I personally don't believe that Wraithbone is actually alive, the comparison to organic matter is shockingly accurate. You see, when Wraithbone is created, a portion of it stays behind in the warp and remains connected to its physical counterpart in our universe, very much like how living beings are connected to their souls. Okay, I've beaten around the bush for long enough. We now know what Wraithbone is, so what exactly got retconned and why was everybody so upset? Well, in the Eldar 10th edition codex, we got a few sentences that seem to contradict the core of what Wraithbone is supposed to be. It states simply, the Wraithbone substance from which each craft world is wrought is a composite material formed from various compounds, ores, and minerals. It is as much grown as it is forged. It's only a couple of sentences, but they have some pretty huge implications, and Eldar fans were not happy. The most common complaint is that Wraithbone has always been described to us as concentrated warp energy, but now it seems GW is telling us that it's just a bunch of ores and minerals, i.e., not really much different from any other construction component used by the other factions. It went from being this mythical, unknowable substance to just a bunch of rocks. Many Warhammer fans have pointed out that the craft world Eldar are supposed to be a post-scarcity society. They could conjure anything they needed out of the Immaterium and thus had no need to raid like their Dark Eldar cousins or mine and till the land like the Exodites. If Wraithbone is not just raw warp energy anymore, and it instead requires ore and minerals from the physical universe in order to create it, then they're not post-scarcity at all. Quite literally the opposite. They need matter in order to make matter. Now, of course, that may seem like a subtle difference at first, but if you, my friend, have ever watched Full Metal Alchemist, then you know that equivalent exchange can be a right bitch. By comparison, making matter from nothing is like having the power of a god. A lot of people are also really upset about that second line, that Wraithbone is as much grown as it is forged. What many Warhammer fans have taken away from this is that Wraithbone originally could be summoned from nothing, but now it has to be harvested like some type of crop. Now, I've admitted this in the past, but I'll say it again for clarification. When it comes to the Craft World Eldar's lore, they're probably the faction that I know the least about. Most of my knowledge about the Eldar comes from the Dark Eldar source material, because what can I say? I'm a fan of aggressively try-hard, edgy factions and characters. I know what Wraithbone is, because it tends to get mentioned a lot, but I've never really done a deep dive into this stuff. So I took it upon myself to learn as much as I could about Wraithbone and challenge my previously held beliefs in order to see if this really was a hard retcon or just a big old nothing burger. I downloaded dozens of PDFs of Eldar lore and was specifically focused on anything that mentioned Wraithbone. Some of the sources dated all the way back to 1990. And let me tell you, this led me down a pretty ridiculous rabbit hole that left me feeling like I was going insane, but we'll get into that later in the video. Before we dive into my findings, I very quickly want to establish how I personally categorize retcons, as even though the term retcon itself has a very toxic reputation amongst nerd communities, retcons are not inherently a bad thing. Quite often, when they're done right, they can actually be really good for a franchise. So I personally break them down into 3 separate categories, and I like to call them seamless retcons, hard retcons, and phantom retcons. A phantom retcon is not actually a retcon at all. It's what happens when obscure information gets published in a widely available source, i.e. something that has existed in the lore for years or even decades, but most people never knew about it. So when it suddenly shows back up again in a more common source, everyone starts freaking out and calling it a retcon. A famous example of this would be the 13 Black Crusades, all having smaller objectives. Now, a seamless retcon is the good kind of retcon. It's a retcon that's so smooth, most will not even question it. It's as if that information has always been there. These can come in a lot of different forms, but most of the time it's when all the retcon is doing is adding more information that supports what came before without changing it. Pretty much the entirety of the Horus Heresy novel line falls into this category. And finally, you've got the bad kind of retcons, the hard retcon. The one that doesn't really add anything of value and only takes away. The ones that seemingly spit on decades worth of established canon in order to shoehorn in something that no one asked for or to explain away a mystery in the most unsatisfying way possible. Now, needless to say, most people assume the Wraithbone change falls into the hard retcon category. But is this actually true? Well, we can break this retcon up into the 3 components that people are taking issue with. Number 1, the insinuation that Wraithbone has nothing to do with warp energy at all anymore. Number 2, that Wraithbone is grown rather than being sung into existence via bone singers. And 3, whether with or without warp energy, some or all of Wraithbone is made up of mundane ores, minerals, and other compounds. So let's examine each of these one by one, and we'll get the easy one out of the way first, and that's whether or not Wraithbone can be grown. Yes, it absolutely can. Wraithbone has been described as plant-like since the very beginning. This doesn't actually contradict anything. Wraithbone can be summoned into existence, yes, but existing Wraithbone can also be tended and nurtured to grow larger or into a more intricate shape by a bone singer. This is quite literally how they repair Wraithbone ship damage. When there's a big hole in the side of a void vessel, the repair process is them causing it to grow back together. There's also forests of Wraithbone that sprout up out of the Infinity Circuit on the Craft Worlds, and many bone singers working on particularly complex works of art can spend years adding to it piece by piece and encouraging different parts of it to grow in a very precise way. You can think of it kind of like a Wraithbone bonsai tree. So none of that's anything new, but what about the ore and minerals that were mentioned? First and foremost, although we tend to refer to everything the Eldar make as Wraithbone, it's technically only a piece of the construction. They use a lot of other components as well. In most complex devices, Wraithbone only makes up the skeleton of the device, whereas everything else is made from different building materials. Some of these are pretty mundane, like glass, leather, crystals, gemstones, and of course, ores, minerals, and compounds. The more interesting additional components are known as psychoplastics, or sometimes as just psychoreactive material. Psychoplastics, much like Wraithbone itself, can be molded and shaped via the application of psychic pressure, kinda like how plastics can be bent into shape with a heat gun. Although there's supposedly tons of different types of psychoplastics, the lore never really goes into any specifics on any of them, and Wraithbone's the only one that's ever been given a name. But Wes, I hear you saying, so what if Wraithbone constructs have ores and minerals in them? It doesn't matter if they're not part of the Wraithbone itself. That's what's being debated here. And that's fair, but I do have a few theories on what might actually be going on here. First, it's possible that going forward, Wraithbone is going to be used by the authors as a catch-all term to describe everything used in a piece of Eldar equipment's construction. Whereas before, they were like, this piece of Wraithbone technology, it technically is only part Wraithbone. It's got a whole bunch of other stuff in it as well. Now, they're just going to refer to it as Wraithbone. This is something that's actually not really that new. They've been doing it in the novels for years. It just makes it easier reading. And because they do it in the lore already, the community has taken to doing it as well. When we talk about Wraithbone, or when the authors describe it, they don't stop literally every single time to explain that it's not just Wraithbone, it's dozens of lesser materials as well. That's clunky. It's always just called Wraithbone, everything is Wraithbone. Now obviously, that's not every single occasion that Wraithbone is ever mentioned, but it does happen more often than you would think. Since everybody seems to be doing this anyways, maybe Games Workshop behind the scenes is just making this official going forward. And honestly, if this is the case, I'm fine with it. It wouldn't be the first time this has been done. It's basically the exact same thing they do with Gene Seed with the Space Marines. And if you didn't know, there's no one definition for what gene seed is. It's hundreds of different things. Literally everything used in the creation of a space marine, from each of their implants all the way down to the germ cells, viral machines, and genetic material contained within them, is all just gene seed. Now here's the thing, is using Wraithbone as an umbrella term like this Games Workshop's official policy going forward? Or was this a one-off occurrence done by one author who was attempting to save space in the codex and may have gotten a little too overzealous with trying to simplify things? That I'm not personally sure of, and we'll just have to wait until we get more Eldar-centric source material in the future to see if it sticks or not. My second theory is kind of still following the same line of logic, but it's a little bit different. When the Eldar create something out of Wraithbone, even setting aside all of the other psychoplastics, we've never actually gotten a good look at what's going on with it at the molecular level. Likewise, we've never seen a piece of it get deconstructed into its constituent parts. I'm just gonna go out on a limb here and assume that if we were to do this with a little flimsy flower pot of Wraithbone and the skeletal core of a craft world, the molecular structure is probably going to look pretty different between the two. And if we were to take a closer look at it in this way, we would most likely see things that are pretty damn similar to compounds, ores, and minerals found throughout the rest of the galaxy. Now, sure, they may not look exactly the same, but they're gonna probably have a pretty similar molecular structure. For the life of me, I don't remember where I read this comment, but somebody pointed this out in one of the comment sections on a post about this particular retcon. And they were saying that Wraithbone is kind of like a replacement arm being produced by a biomancer. You see, the biomancer is using their psychic abilities to channel the energy of the warp into the generation of flesh, bone, skin, hair follicles, red and white blood cells, plasma, etc., etc. But we just refer to the whole thing as an arm. The biomancer made an arm. Now, if somebody in, say, a codex was to refer to that arm as being made out of a lot of different substances, sure, it would be a weird way of wording it, but it wouldn't be a retcon, it would be the truth. Okay, so I know I just made a whole bunch of excuses and did a lot of mental gymnastics to try to make the retcon make sense. Now we have to talk about it being implied that Wraithbone is no longer considered to be concentrated warp energy. I'm not gonna lie to you, when I started doing research for this video, I was pretty cocky. I was convinced all I had to do was read the rest of the codex. Surely this 2-sentence retcon that everyone was freaking out about was simply being taken out of context. All I had to do was find somewhere else in the book where Wraithbone was mentioned, and it would also talk about condensed warp energy. So I read the entire thing. And although I counted Wraithbone being mentioned some 30 times throughout the book, I was actually kinda shocked to find that warp energy was never mentioned. Going off of this book alone, Wraithbone has nothing to do with raw warp energy at all. Okay, so definitely wasn't expecting that. That's definitely ammunition for this being a hard retcon, but I had to do my due diligence. I figured I would go back and read the previous codex to find references to warp energy so I could see explicitly what had changed. So I read through the 9th edition codex, no warp energy. I went to the 8th edition codex, the 7th edition codex, nothing. There was nothing about it being concentrated warp energy in any capacity. Now at this point, not only was I getting frustrated, but I felt like I was losing my mind. I felt like I was experiencing the mandala effect, like I was living in an alternate universe. So now I was committed, and even though I didn't have access to physical copies of the earlier versions of the codex, I had the power of the internet and a bunch of shady websites on my side. Several viruses, and many hours later, I tracked down every Craftworld Eldar codex back to 2nd edition, and in none of them did a single sentence about Wraithbone being made of concentrated warp energy appear. I was losing my goddamn mind. Wraithbone being made from the energy of the warp is the most well-known fact about it. It is a critical piece of the Eldar's lore. But was everybody wrong? Has it always just been a bunch of psychic rocks? Because it wasn't showing up anywhere. Now, sure, all of the other stuff about Wraithbone that we talked about already was in these books. Honestly, it was the same couple of paragraphs being repeated over and over with the most minuscule of alterations. That Wraithbone is grown and cultivated, that it's psycho-reactive, that it's like a plant. Eldar technology is a living thing. They blur the line between science and nature, yada yada yada. But I needed specifically the sentence, Wraithbone is warp energy. Not mental energy, not psychically influenced, nothing that may or may not allude to it. I needed it specifically spelled out. But nope, doesn't exist in the codexes. Meanwhile, over here on the Lexiconum, they've got exactly what I need right here in the second line. It says, Wraithbone is essentially solidified warp energy. There it is, plain as day. They even provided a source, Eldar Codex 2nd edition, page 5. Well, I've got the goddamn page right here, Lexiconum. Where the hell does it say that? It doesn't. Where's my goddamn warp energy, Lexiconum? Now, obviously, I'm being hyperbolic. The people who manage the Warhammer wikis do a great job and put an enormous amount of work into this free and easily accessible resource for the community. But it's why I don't use them for my videos and only trust the actual official source material. It's also why I tell people that the codexes are not the end-all be-all of the lore. If anything, they're the first step in your lore journey. They're the surface level. And you'd be shocked at how much pushback I get whenever I say this. There are people who have told me that the codexes are the only thing that's actually canon. Not the Black Library novels, not the RPGs, the White Dwarfs background books, none of those count, which is a wild take. But if you're one of those people who thinks like this whole warp energy thing is a prime example of what I'm talking about. If you're a person who only gets your lore from the codexes and you consider yourself well-versed in 40K, I promise you, there are things you currently believe about this franchise, truths that you hold sacred that have never been mentioned in a codex. Those core beliefs you have come from one of the sources that you don't consider important. Now, thankfully, I don't subscribe to this nonsensical system of declaring certain things canon and other things not. And from my perspective, if it was made by Gamesworkshop, the Black Library, or anyone creating something for them using their IP, with a few small exceptions like faction-specific endings to a video game with multiple endings, it's canon. And because I don't think like that, I can turn to White Dwarf issue 127, published in 1990, and read this amazing breakdown of the Eldar and their society, where it says right there on page 17, plain as day, a spirit stone is a tool which allows a bone singer to draw raw energy from the warp and shape it into matter. The matter created in this way is called Wraithbone. Perfect, succinct, beautiful. No more words than is necessary. Wraithbone being described like this is something that's been stated in many Black Library novels in the past and a whole bunch of other sources as well that weren't codexes, but I've already wasted way too much time going down this particular rabbit hole, so you're just gonna have to trust me on this one. But even if all that's true, why on earth would Games Workshop choose to not put such a seemingly important fact about Wraithbone in any of the Eldar codexes? Like, if it happened once or twice, it would just be a mistake and they'll get it in the next one. But from what I could tell, they've never done this. Now, it's definitely possible that I missed a reference, so if you know of one in any Eldar codex, definitely let me know about it, but I don't think I did. Honestly, this omission is even stranger when you think about what a codex is supposed to be. It is the source book on a faction, the primary resource that most people who want to learn about that faction are going to turn to. It's the book that serves as their entry point into that faction's lore. If I'm being honest with you, I don't know why they did this. Games Workshop, like every other company, makes decisions behind the scenes that to them make sense, but to us may seem stupid and nonsensical. With this one in particular though, I do have a theory on why this is the case, but admittedly, I'm gonna have to use some anecdotal evidence, go on a small tangent, and give y'all a peek behind the curtain of what it's like to make these videos. But I promise you I have a point to make. A little while after starting this channel, I started getting sponsors, and every now and then, they'll be from a company that's utilizing the Warhammer IP. I've made promotional material for Darktide, Rogue Trader, and everybody's favorite 40k game, Tacticus. But the one relevant to this specific example was when I ended up taking a sponsorship from Wizards of the Coast to make a video promoting the Warhammer 40k decks that were coming out. And I was super excited about this. Not only do I love 40k, but I've been playing Magic the Gathering since I was like 9 years old. Now, admittedly, at that point in time, I had been on like a 6-year break from it, and it actually was those 40k decks that got me back into it, but that's a totally different story for another video. Anyways, the goal of the promotion was to unveil a few previously never before seen cards that were going to be in the Imperium-centric commander deck. The big one that I was given to reveal was the Golden Throne. Now, since my channel is a lore channel, I asked if it would be cool if I turned this reveal video into a lore video. explaining the lore of both the Emperor, the Golden Throne, and a quick summary of what 40K is all about, as I was anticipating most of the people watching this to be Magic fans that may not be familiar with the source material. The representatives that I was working with said that sounded great and to do what I do best. So I did it. I put it together and sent it out for approval. Well, they, as in the agency who was representing Wizards of the Coast, sent it over to Hasbro, who then sent it to Gamesworkshop, who then sent it back to the agency to give to me alongside a list of notes. The big takeaway was that they liked the video, they liked the direction I had gone with it, but I had gone way off the rails when it came to the lore. I went deep on the Emperor. I was talking about how his name is actually Neoth and he's a perpetual. He was born in the year 8000 BC when a whole bunch of shamans sacrificed themselves. I started talking about the Webway project, whether or not he's a hero or a villain, his falling out with all the other perpetuals, how nobody knows what he actually looks like because he projects a psychic distortion in your brain that makes you see whatever he wants you to see, etc., etc. They, however, wanted me to just stick to the basics. That the Emperor has stood vigil on the Golden Throne for over 10,000 years, that he's the carrion god of humanity and pushes back the darkness and all that basic stuff. Now, of course, I keep it professional. This was a job. They were paying me to make a video, so if that's what they wanted, then that's what I would make. But I didn't really understand why they thought these changes were necessary. From my perspective, all of that stuff was what made the Emperor so interesting. All of the deep pulls that it took me years to learn. Those to me were the things that would hook a newcomer's interest, but they disagreed. I don't remember the exact conversation that I had with this representative, but the basic gist was that when it comes to the lore, there's the lore, and then there's the lore. There's the core lore that is the skeletal framework of what 40K is, and it's what everybody is introduced to when they get into this franchise. Everything that I was talking about, although true and part of the canon, was not part of that core. Now, it seems simple in retrospect, but at the time, I found this concept super intriguing. It was like a light bulb went off in my head, and a whole bunch of synapses were firing all at once. Because from my perspective, as somebody who's been reading about 40K for over 20 years, what kept me hooked is that I still find something new to learn about every single day. I, like many others, started with the codexes as my introduction to the lore. Then I moved on to the campaign books, and didn't even read my first Black Library novel until like 2008 or 2009, which was the first book in the Wordbearers trilogy if you're curious. So this guy's description of what's considered core lore and what isn't was kind of mirroring my own personal journey throughout this franchise. I don't want to give Games Workshop too much credit here, as I don't think they have this like master strategy where everything is meticulously placed throughout the source material and they have complete control over how every single person experiences the lore. As A, I just don't think they put nearly that much effort in, and B, they don't have control over third-party lore content like the wikis or the videos that us YouTubers make. But when it comes to the things that they can control, by keeping certain information out of certain sources, this causes the reader to always be operating with an incomplete picture. So every time they go to a new source on the same faction or character, there's something new that feels like a big reveal. Now, sure, you could just read that little factoid on a wiki, but when you find it for yourself in a book, I don't know, something about that just feels good. It feels like you've discovered something on your own, and it's exciting. I personally just had one of those the other night. I finished the novel Firecast, and at one point, Commander Cutler tells a member of the Tau Watercast to go to hell, and the Tau responds, "Our species has no concept of hell." And just the other day, I was wondering if the Tau were all atheist because they have minuscule souls. If having a medium-sized soul like humanity causes you to have a bunch of spiritual beliefs and superstitions, and having a massive soul like the Eldar causes you to have full-blown conversations with your gods, astral journeys into the afterlife, and the ability to reincarnate, is the same true in the opposite direction? Do the Tau's tiny souls cause them to not have any spiritual beliefs at all because they have quite literally no connection to the realm of spirits and spirituality? And sure enough, here's a guy in a random Dark Coil book that I'm listening to late at night saying exactly this. Not just that the Tau do not believe in an afterlife, they have no concept of one. Fascinating stuff, but I'm getting off topic, and that's a mystery I'm still working on in the background. I'll make a video on it someday. Anyways, this seemingly strategic placement of information across various sources is most likely done to just not bombard a newcomer with too much information too quickly. Getting into 40k lore is already intimidating enough as it is for newcomers, so I get why in the most common source material they're going to have access to, like a codex, you'd keep it to the basics. Now, personally speaking, when it comes to Wraithbone, I would consider it being concentrated warp energy is something that probably should be considered by GW to be one of those basics, something of a foundational piece of information that gives a lot of context to both the Wraithbone itself and those who create it. And there is no logical reason why you would not include that in a codex. But as I have learned over the last couple of days, obviously, Games Workshop disagrees. So if you've put up with all of my tangents and rambling in this video, at the end of all this, what do I think about this retcon? How do I rate it out of 10? Is it a full-blown hard retcon? Is it a 10 out of 10 Black Crusade situation? Or is it just a big old nothing burger? If I'm being honest with you, I think this is a nothing burger 100%. I think this was just some clunky wording that really isn't out of line with any of the previous Eldar codexes that have been released over the last 30 years. I'll fully admit I could be totally wrong on this, and Games Workshop, for some unfathomably stupid reason, may have decided that Wraithbone would be better as just a bunch of rocks going forward and completely discredit everything that's come before. It certainly seems to be what a lot of reactionary ragebait type folks believe to be true, but I don't think so. Worst case scenario, Wraithbone ends up just being treated like an umbrella term from now on, and even if that does happen, nothing's really changed. They've already been doing that in the books. We'll just have to wait and see until another piece of Eldar lore gets released that mentions Wraithbone to see if these changes end up sticking. Now, I'm not gonna lie to you, I'm probably a little bit delusional right now. I stayed up all night working on this video and I'm very tired. But there is a part of me that thinks if they did that, it would be really funny. Like, can you imagine Games Workshop coming out and being like, yeah, bro, it's rocks. It's always been rocks. I would hate it. I would be mad as but that would be so goddamn funny. Okay, I changed my mind. I'm on board. Make it rocks, Games Workshop. Anyways, as always, let me know your thoughts on this down in the comment section. I'm genuinely curious what y'all think about this particular retcon. Is it a big deal like some people are saying, or just another nothing burger? If you could retcon one thing out of 40k, what would it be and why? Was there something that was already retconned in this series that you disagree with and you would change it back if you could? Do you think retcons are ultimately a good or a bad thing for a franchise like 40k? Also, let me know all of your thoughts, comments, questions, concerns, and ideas for future videos down in the comment section below. As always, big thanks to everyone who supports the work that I do, and I will catch you all in the next one.